Hello, thank you very much for... Where am I? Clyde Bank, I believe. Thank you all. I got a bit lost coming here. My name is Julie Smith and I'm here representing Soul Sisters Voting With Our Feet. This is the second of the meetings we have organised. The previous one we were looking at gender identity and young people. This one we are looking at women and sport. So this evening we've got two speakers who will speak on the subject, and after that we will have time for discussion, and hopefully we can look at steps we can take together to kind of counteract what's happening with women and girls in sport and get a bit of plan of action, or if there's people who are interested in this and have some skills and expertise about getting up a wee group around looking at this specific theme within the whole gender identity thing, I think would be really useful, if that's okay with people. Do I have housekeeping? Toilets are somewhere and there's other things elsewhere.
Doors.
Doors, maybe. To manual and washing. And there's a bar. So, anyway, first of all, I would like to introduce, we have Alison Weir and we have Frances, what's your surname, Frances? Trainer. Which you should know because she's involved with Soul Sisters, and we've got somebody called Trainer, which is amusing. Anyway, we have Alison Weir and Frances Trainer here, and Alison's going to kick us off with a discussion on women in sport, and Frances is going to follow up looking at football in specifically with that. So, Alison, I'll hand over to you.
How do you want it?
Just push that up. Use it if you want. Do you want me to hold it? Are you not standing up?
Otherwise, I just... Right, hi everyone. Tonight I'm going to be talking a bit about women in sport. I've been involved in sport all my life. My father was a professional footballer back in the 1950s. I did sport several hours a day, 7 days a week, and competed at school, club, county and national level in various different sports. And both of my children were youth internationalists, one in hockey and one in athletics. Sport gave us all the opportunity to compete, but it also gave us a sense of team spirit, of belonging, and opportunities we would not otherwise have got. And particularly in the case of my daughter, it gave her confidence, something that had been sadly lacking until she got involved in sport. Sport can also have a huge socio-economic impact, particularly on girls from disadvantaged backgrounds. And I was particularly struck, and one of the areas where I first got involved in this was in Dorian Coleman's evidence to the Court for Arbitration for Sport in Caster Semenya's case. And Dorian Coleman's a law professor at Duke University in the US, and her description of the impact it had on her life competing internationally and the opportunities and the scholarships that she had gone through that. I remain involved in sports today as a member of the Scottish Athletics Records Committee, and that suits both my love of athletics and my slightly geeky maths stats in nature. Win-win for me. And I'm also a gender critical feminist. My friend Kate laughs when I say that into the issue of gender ideology via sports, but I stayed for lesbians. Honestly, why wouldn't you? But what I mean is that I became aware of gender ideology via sport, but became an active feminist when I saw lesbians being abused at pride marches, and I was just horrified at the outright homophobia I was seeing on our streets. When I originally spoke about sport at the Alloa Women's Festival, and when I was writing my talk then, I had a chat with a friend about some of the issues that are important to female athletes, like how periods and menstrual cycles impact performance, eating disorders, and there are many eating disorders in different sports, and how that impacts body, bone development, etc. Sex abuse in coaching setups, and their impact on the girls. And I'd like to have talked about those issues, but in fact, what I did talk about was the biggest issue that's facing women and girls in sport today, and that's the inclusion of male-born athletes in female sport. That talk was on the 5th of March, so 2 short months ago. But as we'll see, things move fast in the world of sport. And before coming to talk to you tonight, I've had to update substantially what I spoke about that day. So in looking at the inclusion of male-bodied athletes in women's sport, how did we get to the point where there are now numerous male-born athletes competing in women's and girls' sport? And from a personal perspective, I think the trans lobby has been fairly clever about this. A few years ago, there was an excellent Rainbow Laces campaign, and that was all about to increase inclusion of gay athletes and eradicate homophobic abuse, to make it a more welcoming environment. It was an excellent campaign and an issue that it was vital that we addressed. But gay athletes were of course competing in the appropriate sex class. If you watch the trans lobby's arguments, they are always framed in the same terms of inclusion and athletes just wanting to compete. And I think that's one of the reasons that until recently there has been limited pushback from governing bodies. But identities don't play sport, bodies play sport. And sport is not segregated to recognise women's feminine qualities, but to ensure fairness and safety for women competitors. So in order to understand the issue, we really need to look at why sport is segregated by sex in the first place. Why don't we just have open categories? Well, there are more than 6,000 differences between male and female bodies. They include average height differences, longer limbs, narrower hips, and the angle from the femur to the knee, which is called the Q angle, and it allows for a much longer stride in a man than in a woman. Bigger hands and feet, and that allows you to catch balls more easily in the aid swimming. Big feet just help swimming. Larger lungs and hearts, that allows more efficient oxygen transfer through the body. Different muscle mass, different proportions of twitch fibres, and twitch fibres are the one that allow you to, the springiness that allows you to jump or to sprint fast. These differences provide a significant physical advantage, and none of these are significantly impacted by suppression of testosterone. The only current peer-reviewed study on the impact of testosterone is a Swedish one, and it concluded that suppressing testosterone for a year had only a minimal impact on muscle mass. Even at current levels, a trans woman has a testosterone level many, many times that of a native female. And during 2021, the author of that report is a guy called Dr. Tommy Lundberg, who works at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, together with Dr. Emma Hilton, who some of you will know tweets on under the handle @FondofBeatles. They completed a report looking at the male advantage over females in sport and concluded that those ranged from around 10 to 13% in sports like rowing and swimming and track athletics, through 29 to 34%, so it's getting quite high, in activities such as golf drives and cricket bowling and athletics field events, up to as high as over 50% in baseball pitching and hockey drag flips. And these are all statistics, but what does it mean in real life? What does that mean in the difference in performance? Well, what it means is that a male will run 100 metres around a second faster than a female. Now that actually ends in a difference of about 18 metres at the end of the race, just because of different speeds throughout the race. A male golfer will on average hit a ball 55 metres further than a woman golfer, and a male pole vaulter will vault around a metre higher than a female pole vaulter, and so on and so on. In 2021, the fastest time that a woman ran the 100 metres was 10.54 seconds. Now that's blooming fast. It's really close to Flojo's world record. And in 2021, more than 1,000 male athletes beat that time. In athletics, the average age at which a male will exceed the female world record is 14. So 14-year-old boys can run faster than grown women. Each year, thousands of males exceed the best performances in the world set by women. And actually in athletics, we keep age group bests from the age of 5, would you believe? And I looked through the records for all the age groups, and they're kept for all different events, from jumping to running to distance running and even throwing. There is only one of those records where the girls' record is better than the boys', and it's the 5-year-old 60 metres. Every other record is held by a boy, and they just get bigger and bigger and bigger as time goes on. For those of you that are old enough to remember the little health books we used to get for our children when they were young, the charts for boys showed different averages even from birth. Boys are bigger than girls. And they have the narrow pelvis and all the other things that will give you those advantages as you grow. Testosterone suppression doesn't overcome genetics. So the issue is not actually one of inclusion. Everybody can participate in sport. The issue is how and why we segregate sport into different categories, and we have to get governing bodies to focus back on that. Sport is segregated to address physical differences where those differences confer an unfair advantage. In some sports, like equestrianism, there is no segregation. Men and women compete together, as the advantage is not seen as significant. Some sports are segregated purely by sex, and that's things like swimming, track and field, rugby and football. This seeks to address the more than 6,000 differences between male and female physiology. Some sports are segregated by sex and weight categories to ensure skill is recognised and athletes can compete fairly and safely. I mean, a heavyweight boxer competing with a flyweight boxer would not only have a significant physical advantage, but would also pose a threat of serious injury to the flyweight. An argument is often brought up regarding the inclusion of trans women in female sport is what I call the tall woman argument, and the fact that sports are not segregated for height, which may confer an advantage. But I mean, the simple answer to this is that whilst there might be a slight advantage, it's not considered significant enough to segregate sport for this. And in sport, we look at averages for each class of competitor, and it's worth remembering here that one of the best female sprinters of the last decade is barely 5 foot tall. She's tiny. It's also worth noting that a tall woman is also likely to be at a significant disadvantage to a male of the same height. Swimmers Ryan Lochte and Missy Franklin are both around the same height and have the right, what I call wingspan, but arm span. Both are world record beaters, and in Missy's favourite event, Ryan Lochte is approximately 10 seconds faster. Missy wouldn't even get into the final of an open competition, never mind be a winner or a record holder. So participation by transgender males in female sports is increasing. Males are taking female national high school titles in America. They're denying girls scholarships. CC Telfer took an NCAA hurdles title, having previously sat at 390th in the male rankings. And those who've been watching the news over the last few months will have seen Leah Thomas ripping up the women's swimming records, despite competing as Will Thomas on the male Penn State team 2 years ago. But we'll talk more of Leah and Emily Bridges later. Another factor that we can't really dismiss when we look at this issue is abuse by individuals or rogue nations. Now, those of us that were involved in sport, or even just watching it in the 1970s and 80s, will be aware of doping either state-sponsored or by individuals. Types posted by athletes like Florence Griffiths-Joyner or Marita Kopp were widely suspected to have benefited from the use of testosterone, and they remain unattainable for athletes today. Are we really naive enough to think that some nation will not persuade perhaps a runner just below Olympic level, to take testosterone suppressants for a year and make a farce of women's sport altogether. And if you think that's far-fetched, then you weren't watching the Russians and the East Germans and things back in the 70s and 80s. And in talking about testosterone, it's also worth remembering that the use of artificial testosterone by female athletes is prohibited. And any female athlete caught doping can expect a substantive punitive ban. Why then should a trans woman athlete who has benefited from testosterone for years be allowed to compete? Particularly where the level that is currently set, for competition is still much higher than any female's natural testosterone. We're often told there is not enough evidence to draw conclusions about the impact of testosterone on athletics performance, but actually there's substantial evidence, and not just from recent studies. The biggest case study on the impact of testosterone on athletic performance took place in the 1970s and 1980s. If the only difference between a male and female athlete is their level of testosterone, then why during that widespread doping era did no female ever get near to elite male levels of performance? If that is the only difference. Another major issue we need to consider when we're talking about the inclusion of trans women in female sports is safety, particularly in the arena of contact sport. Athletics and swimming are relatively safe in this area, but in its review of the inclusion of trans women in female rugby, World Rugby concluded that there was an increased risk of around 30% of serious injury, and that was unacceptable. Those who follow UK rugby may be aware of the case of Kelly Morgan. Kelly Morgan is a trans-identified male who's well over 6 foot and hoped to compete in Welsh women's rugby. This is Kelly who in training broke the coach's ankle and knocked fellow players down like deck chairs. During a recent rugby match between two high school teams in Guam, a trans-identified male player injured 3 female players from the other team's high school squad. And the coach spoke of the aggressive nature that was witnessed and commented that body size, body strength and the ability to apply force with that size and strength completely dominates any girl that I have on my team. Just this morning, I read about an under-13 girls rugby match in England that was abandoned by the referee because there were 2 trans girls playing who were causing injuries right, left and centre to the female players. And the referee decided that it couldn't go on, that this was too significant for it to go on. If anything, risk is higher in non-elite sport. I played mixed hockey when I was at university, and the mix of much bigger and stronger men with what was more limited skills meant that there was just a much higher risk of serious injury. I mean, the balls were flying at our faces and things. You know, something that an elite male player wouldn't do because they know how to control the ball, but where at a more local level, the skill just wasn't there to prevent serious injury to females. What I'd ask each governing body is how they will explain to the parents or loved ones of a seriously injured female player that a male's feelings were more important than their daughter's safety. Many of the examples that I've given so far have come from elite sport, but the inclusion of male-bodied players is impacting grassroots sport as well. Some of this evidence is very recent, so I'm going to apologise if I actually read a bit more closely, but I've taken this from evidence that I've only seen over the last couple of weeks. A 6-foot transgender woman who used to play in men's football has been selected to represent England University's football team. The player Blair Hamilton plays for Hastings United Football Club. It's not in the top flight of women's football. The team plays in the London and South East Regional Women's Division 1 South. But Blair's denying a place to a female athlete in that side, and Blair is taking a place meant for a female in the university side. Fair Play for Women, a feminist campaign group, has established that women and girls across Britain are dropping out of recreational sport because they are being pressured to compete against transgender women who are biologically male, with many participants feeling pressured to remain silent. The dossier from Fair Play for Women includes testimony from a female hockey player who in an amateur London league walked off the pitch when given the task of marking a transgender opponent. And what she said was, the person was 6'4" tall, had an Adam's apple, and she said, every time I was going for the ball, the transgender woman was far faster, and after a few minutes I just took myself off. I was in tears. I came to play against a female opposition, and there was a male on the pitch, and I just felt the sense of fairness was not there. She felt unable to complain in case she was branded a transphobe. A parent and cricket coach from the south of England told Fair Play for Women he was concerned about the safety of girls, one as young as 12, asked to play against a team containing a trans woman. As a father to these girls, and they were aged 14 and 16, I find that unacceptable, uncomfortable and dangerous, both morally and physically, he said. Cyclist Bo Novak said she stopped attending a women-only road cycling session when a trans woman led the group she joined in southwest England. She observed that it was advertised as leisure rides for women in small groups led by women. But a male-bodied person was leading the group, not just taking part, and he was much stronger than the rest of us and went too fast. Other issues that we need to look at when considering the inclusion of trans women in women's sport are that athletes need to change and shower, and that can become a significant problem for female players. Hannah Mounsey, who's a trans-identified male who competed on the Australian handball team, was selected to play for Australia in an international competition. But things came to a head when changing facilities were discussed. The girls on the team did not want to shower with Mounsey, who retained his penis. And to address this, Handball Australia arranged a separate changing facility to protect Mounsey's privacy and dignity. Mounsey was having none of it and said that either he got to shower and change with the girls or he wasn't going. A fair play to Handball Australia, they didn't back down and Mounsey walked. For teenage girls, just knowing there's a trans woman at the club can be enough to put them off, for fear of embarrassing encounters in the changing room or in the toilets. By the time girls reach 15, sports participation has dropped to 14%. And this is only making things worse, it's going down. Inclusion of male-bodied athletes can also be a significant bar to women from certain religious groups who aren't able to participate where there's a male-bodied person present. So by including male-born people in women's sport, we're excluding women from participating in women's sport. So, how do we change things? First and foremost, I will say that courage calls to courage. And the more people are prepared to speak out and take a stand, the more others will gain the courage to take similar action. And we've seen this in practice recently. This is the area of my talk that's changed most since I spoke 2 months ago in Alloa. Things have been moving really, really quickly in the world of sport, and it all really started with Leah Thomas. Later you'll hear, or we were potentially going to hear, an interview with the mother of one of the girls that competed against Leah. And if you get a chance to listen to it, really do. She talked about, it was harrowing listening to her, and she talked about her daughter's journey there, about the sacrifices she had made, and knowing that she was going into the pool with no chance of beating this male-born athlete. That was the first time that I'd really heard current athletes start to speak out. 1 or 2 of the swimmers spoke out. Leah, as well, was a reasonable college swimmer. As Leah, he's an Olympic standard athlete. Athletes don't like it. Parents don't like it. there were talk of protests at that swimming competition, with individual swimmers saying they wouldn't swim against Leah. They did in the end, but if you get a chance to watch the videos and just listen to the cheers for the second athlete that comes home. Thomas's participation in female competition also led to high-profile resignation of one of the most senior officials in US swimming. And this, together with a public outcry, led to a review by USA Swimming and a change of rules. A trans athlete now has to suppress their testosterone for 3 years instead of 1. And even if they manage to meet those standards, there is a 3-person medical panel who will assess whether the testosterone that they benefited from as they grew up has left them with an unfair advantage. Now, it's not far enough, in my opinion, but it's a hell of a lot better than it has been. Two months ago, reports from British Cycling suggested that athletes might be fined or lose their licence for challenging the inclusion of trans women in female competition. So, I didn't expect to hear any cyclists speak out. But when Emily Bridges was announced as part of the women's team at the Cycling Nations Cup, just weeks after winning medals at the male British University Championships, athletes in a number of sports began to speak out. First of all, it was athletics. Several members of the GB athletics team posted comments about the unfairness of allowing male-bodied athletes to compete in women's sports. It was reported that female cyclists were proposing a boycott of the British Omnium Championship, in which Bridges was due to compete against Laura Kenny. And GB's Olympic cycling chief Sarah Symington signed a letter calling for a stop to transgender riders such as Emily Bridges competing in women's events. We've recently seen high-profile cyclists speak out. Katie Archibald and Dame Laura Kenny have spoken of the unfairness of allowing male-bodied athletes to compete in their sport. Now, Laura Kenny is probably the most famous female cyclist in the world. And if you have people like that now with the courage to speak out, others will follow. In response to this, British Cycling have now suspended their transgender policy. 2 months ago they were saying, dare say anything and you can lose your licence. Now they've suspended their policy and state they're going to review their transgender inclusion policy. Now that's some turnaround in 2 months. Denmark's Olympic Committee has announced its findings that the advantage held by trans women athletes is such that they should never compete in female categories. Let's hope that many others have the courage to follow suit. The impact of speaking out is not limited to elite sport either. In Scottish rugby, a parent contacted the Scottish Rugby Union concerned about the inclusion of a trans-identified male in one of the women's teams. She pointed to the World Rugby report that suggested an increased safety risk of 30%, and she asked about their safety impact assessment. She also asked for details of their insurer, given World Rugby's injury risk assessment, and the SRU wrote to the club and told them they cannot field the transgender player. England Rugby have been flip-flopping back and forwards for blooming months on this issue, about tests and limits they can put on transgender players, and effectively the proposals they put forward would have prevented virtually any transgender women competing in rugby. But they were just, well, in my view, they were too scared to say, no, you can't compete. They were scared that they were going to be accused of transphobia. But they, again, are now looking at the sports councils of home nations' joint statement on the issue and are reviewing their policies. There's also recent reports about men playing in Scottish women's football, and Francis will talk a bit more about football. And the Scottish Women's Federation are having to update, first of all, the transgender policies following the discovery that there was no monitoring of the regulations with reference to testosterone levels. That came from parent and player pressure. That came from ordinary people. It didn't come from stars and it didn't come from governments. So, and I hope we'll talk about this a bit more later, what can you do to change in your sports? Well, one of the things, none of the changes I've talked about happened without pressure from athletes, parents and officials. Change happens because people speak out. I know it can seem daunting, but the more people speak out, the less governing bodies can ignore these issues. The changes to football policy and actually monitoring testosterone came from player and parent pressure. The action in the rugby case came from parent pressure. Sports governing bodies tend to be dominated by men who either don't really care about women's sport or who won't tackle the issue for fear of being labelled transphobic. But as more and more people speak out, it does have an impact and they can't ignore the issue. The first thing I would do is get informed. Look at the website for your sports governing body. Check what the transgender inclusion policy is. They will have one. Go to the Fair Play for Women website where there's lots of useful information and resources. Respond to any consultations. Read Emma and Tommy's report and anything else you can find. The local rugby action came out of the World Rugby report because that parent had read it. Ask about safety reports. Ask what's been commissioned. Ask what they cover. Ask to see them. The IOC has been a bit unhelpful in this area. They've passed a decision about inclusion back to individual sports. But as highlighted earlier, the sports councils of the home nations recently made a joint statement which concluded that you can either have inclusion or you can have fairness, but you can't have both. Though they again stopped short of saying that trans-identified males competing in women's sport is wrong. Although sport is run by governing bodies and not government, lobby your MSP to ask questions, to put pressure on these governing bodies. Write to your local council. It's your local councils that run local authority swimming pools and leisure facilities. Ask them what their policies are. Ask them whether they've undertaken an equality impact assessment. Ask them if they're excluding people by allowing males in. Are they indirectly discriminating against women? If you're self-excluding from facilities because there may be a male-bodied person present, then you are being discriminated against. You're being prevented from using those facilities. But I've contributed to a number of consultations in different sports, and the only sport that I can truly say I know a lot about is athletics. But the principles are the same in most sports. The more of us that speak up, the more sports will be unable to ignore the issue and the evidence. Courage calls to courage. So I haven't got any more on this, so thanks for listening.
I just want to abuse my position as chair just for a minute. The paper that you were talking about, which was a consultation of all the equalities groups of all the sports councils in the United Kingdom, which came out and said basically you can be safe and fair, or you can have men and women's sports. And that paper, hopefully if you get your details we can send you, that's there on the Sports Council if you look up. Is it Sports Scotland?
It's the Sports Councils for the Sports.
Yeah, but the Sports Scotland will have it there. So, and it's got all the evidence. The really frightening part of it is when you look at the bit where they interviewed women who are involved in sport, who said they couldn't speak up about the women who work for all these sports councils, who couldn't speak up about all the women who have been told if you say anything about this you will lose your job or whatever. So I would recommend you read it, it's absolutely terrifying. But they came up with this thing. Do you know, Alison, I just wondered if you knew if this was actually having any impact on the individual governing bodies?
The honest answer is I'm not sure that the report itself had a huge impact. But what is having a huge impact is people speaking out, and people are now returning to it and looking at it in the light of it. I mean, in completing that report, they looked at Tommy Lundberg and Emma Hilton's report on sport and the advantages there. They'll have looked at World Rugby's report into the increased risk of injury. And that, they looked at substantial amounts of evidence in doing it, but I genuinely do not think that the statement itself and the report had a huge impact. What is now having an impact is people speaking out.
Okay, thank you.